Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and as you can see, we are looking ahead to the Las Vegas Grand Prix for F1 Fantasy. Now, before I get fully excited, because we're back from F1 after a 3-week break, I do have some very important information, and please, everyone, listen up. Our friends over at FanAmp have created a survey for all of you F1 Fantasy managers. They've got on all of us F1 Fantasy content creators all together to help them refine this survey, and the whole idea of it to get our voices heard and try to make some changes to the game. Because if you're like me, and if you know anything about my content on F1 Fantasy, we love the game, but there's so many little details that need changing to make this game as good as it can be. So please, everyone, spare the 5 to 10 minutes. Do the survey. I'm going to put it in the description. I'm going to put it in the comments as well. However, sometimes it's a bit dodgy in the comments, so I'll also put what to search up on here if you want to do it. Please, everyone, share this with all of your friends who play F1 Fantasy, and let's try to push our ideas and make the game so much better and get F1 to hear us out. So, realistically, Brazil is the first one we need to talk about because you don't take that into consideration when you're picking your teams for Vegas. Now, it sounds crazy when I say that, but it was such a chaotic race against the status quo that we had. I don't think anything like that's going to happen again. Verstappen's not going to get 77 points. There's not going to be a double Alpine podium. So for me, Verstappen is still too expensive realistically going into Vegas on a normal race weekend, because Ferrari and McLaren, when it's dry, look better. Then again, with the weather, there's no longer going to be any of this chaotic weather conditions where it could be raining or not, because the next 3 races, Vegas, Qatar and Abu Dhabi, they're all in dry environment, which means if it rains, I'll give everyone a gazillion pounds, because it's not happening basically. So the gist of it is, when you're looking at your teams, what's going to be more helpful for you is looking at Mexico's results, Cota's results, and last year's Vegas results. So with that being said, let's talk about the best constructors, and it's pretty plain and simple. It still is a 2-horse race between McLaren and Ferrari. McLaren, of course, they didn't have a great Brazil, but in Mexico and Cota, they look like the second and first best. Then again, Ferrari, second and first best since the second half of the season, realistically, and you can see it in the points. They tend to beat Mercedes, they tend to beat Red Bull, and the issue with Red Bull is that they have Perez. So I expect most teams to have McLaren and Ferrari. Remember, cheap constructors aren't really worth it, because constructors are the most important in your team. They get you the most points. And VCARB is one of the better cheap constructors. I mean, take a look at Haas as well. They're not doing terribly, but there's just such a big difference in points between the big dogs and the smaller teams. There's such a big gap that even a 2-times driver potentially couldn't even cover that up. So be careful with constructors. Realistically, McLaren and Ferrari, best options. But if you want to go for a differential, Red Bull Ferrari, Red Bull McLaren, if you have the money to still have a 2 premium driver build. So with the constructors out of the way, let's talk about the best cheap drivers you can have, because it's still so confusing what the best cheap driver is going to be. Now, from what we've seen in Cota and Mexico, and sort of still parts of Brazil, we almost had a potential chance of Tsunoda getting into the lead if there wasn't a red flag. But VCARB and Haas still look very strong as actual competitors to try to get into the top 10. However, first place still goes to Franco Colapinto, and that is because he's so cheap, and because he DNF'd, he took a minus on his value, which means this is the time to bring him in. I can't believe people still haven't brought him in. His percentage is so low for a driver who's consistently getting you good points. So for me, it's just a no-brainer that he's the one every single team has to have. Then in second place for me, it's Nico Hülkenberg. And there's quite a bunch of drivers around that 11 million to 12 million range now, and I still think he stands above the rest. Now, he had a dreadful Brazil, but look at the rest of his results. Consistent, and that's what we want in F1 Fantasy this far on into the season. Now, again, like I mentioned, you're starting to see a little bit of a pattern emerge. The reason we want Colapinto, the reason we want Hülkenberg, is because they're all taking hits to their team value. I don't think we're going to see that again for a while, especially Hülkenberg and Colapinto. So you've got to bring them in when they've taken a hit to their price, and potentially, you can afford them now. It's not too much of a crazy drop down, but it's still better than if next weekend you haven't brought them in and they get a 0.5 million increase on their driver values. Now, in third place, I have actually gone for the double Saubers. We've seen it again in Brazil. We saw it again in Mexico. It's actually surprising it's not better to risk it for the chocolate biscuit. And I hate that that is the case, but it's the way it goes. Especially Zhou qualifies P20 And if there's a few DNFs, he gets some points and he gets a 0.5 million increase. Bottas, a little bit different. He's sort of a dud driver because he qualifies better. But if you have both double Saubers, it's not terrible. They rarely crash out now because they're so far off the pace. Just stick them in your team, hope for the best that there's DNFs elsewhere, and so far it's been working out. Now, it is a very safe, risk-free way to play it. So if you want to risk it for the chocolate biscuit, people like Alex Albon's the way to go. Or my fourth pick, which is the V-Carb drivers. And that is because, again, those are the sort of drivers. Tsunoda and Lawson, very similar on driver value now. Those are the drivers who are going to push into the top 10 in qualifying. Try to get you points, like, organically in F1 Fantasy, not from hoping that other drivers DNF. So, cheap driver-wise, Franco Colapinto, Hulkenberg, Double Sauber, the V-Carb drivers, and then you have Albon. I don't think that Alpines are that great of options. They're way too expensive for what they give you now. And look out for when Behrman changes to Magnussen again. But Magnussen's always been quite a risky driver to have. And I think it's just too far along in the season now. You kind of just want to stick with the consistent drivers that you know aren't going to completely destroy your whole weekend. And then let's move on to the best premium drivers you could have. And the top three, like usual, has not changed. However, the way you flip them round will all depend on practice, so keep an eye out for those results, as it really is, will it be McLaren the fastest or will it be Ferraris? However, we actually have a little predicament on our hands. There is no longer a championship battle. McLaren have basically come out and said they are focusing on the Constructors. So I now think Piastri isn't as bad of a shout as he used to be. We saw a lot of team orders in Brazil, which is why I was a little bit anti-Piastri being picked, because we saw Norris was getting ahead of him multiple times because the team told him to let Norris go. Piastri should have won the sprint race. However, because the championship gap is so big now, I don't think they're going to be giving Norris these positions anymore. So Piastri now is cheaper and potentially has the same amount of chance that Norris has of winning the Vegas Grand Prix. So those two are neck and neck at the front. However, this all is dependent on if McLaren are fast at Vegas. And as we've seen last year, Ferrari were very fast at Vegas, which is why Leclerc could be the top guy as well. Come practice. Sainz a little bit different. I think he's so on and off. I think it is between McLaren's and Leclerc. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the practice results say. But for me, right now, Norris is the safe play to be bringing in, hopefully, for your driver of the day, fastest laps, pole positions, etc. Piastri's that little bit of a differential if you want to go for potentially no longer team orders. Try something else if you can't afford a team such as Norris Piastri or Norris Leclerc. And then Leclerc is the dark horse if Ferrari look as good as they did last season here. We saw Leclerc was very fast around here last season, and also the Ferraris looked very good at sort of tracks like this. And there's a lot of elements at Vegas that we saw in Cota and Mexico, which we know the Ferrari cars like. So, keep an eye out on those three. Honorary mentions Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen. However, Max Verstappen, he's just too expensive. He's over 30 million. And I do think on a normal race weekend where there's no crazy rain or anything like that, the Red Bull's just not fast enough anymore. And I just can't see him finishing higher up than third, which as your 2x driver is not good enough. And then finally we get on to the best part of the video, which is your team selections. And like I've sort of mentioned in all of the other videos I've made about F1 Fantasy so far, it's still not changing that much. You've got the 2 premium driver team, which will consist of the big premium drivers of Norris Piastri, if you're feeling safe on the McLarens, Norris Leclerc, of the conventional 1 Ferrari asset with 1 McLaren, see which one's better, then put the 2x on them. You can even go with Piastri and Leclerc to spice things up if you can't afford Norris and Leclerc, because now I do think that's a generally really good team. Now, the cheap driver with all of these 2 premium driver teams will always start off with double Sauber and Colapinto, so it is worth having, let's say, Norris, Leclerc, double Sauber and Colapinto over a single premium driver team of, let's say, Verstappen or Norris with 4 much better cheap drivers. There's not enough points in the cheap drivers to be doing something like that, whereas the premium drivers there are. So for me, you start off with the double Saubers, then you increase Zhou to Albon, then Albon to Hulkenberg, and then Bottas to Zhou, and then Zhou to Albon. And that really is as simple as the 2 premium driver teams get. Like I mentioned, I don't think Verstappen's worth using unless you want a differential, and I don't think many other teams are going to be able to afford any more than that. And all of these teams will have McLaren and Ferrari as their constructor as well, even the single premium driver teams, which I will then get onto now. If you still don't have enough money for the 2 premium driver build, then you have the single premium driver build. And realistically, it's really vital that you look at practice results when it comes to these sorts of predictions. Because single premium driver, you've only got one premium asset, which means you have to get it right. Whether it's Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc, Piastri, or Sainz, look out for whoever looks better in practice, put them in your team, put them in the 2 times. Then the cheap drivers would be Tsunoda, Lawson, Hulkenberg, and Colapinto. If you can't afford this, you do a similar situation where you start off with dropping the V-carb drivers down to Albon. Then if you can't afford that, Albon down to Zhou. Same with the other V-carb driver, drop him down to one of the other Saubers, whichever one you didn't choose, until you have a team that you can afford. Now, there is quite a few talks of people talking about triple premium driver builds, where you drop a constructor like McLaren down to a Mercedes, have Mercedes, Ferrari, and then potentially Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz. However, for me, the constructors are just so important, and take away Brazil, Mercedes have not got anywhere close, even Red Bull most of the time, to Ferrari and McLaren's points, and I feel like you're just missing too much. The gap between Mercedes to Ferrari and McLaren is bigger than the gap to, say, a Lawson or a Zhou up to a Sainz or a Leclerc. Now that we've got the team selections out of the way, let's talk about the chips, and we like to keep it simple over here. If it ain't a sprint race weekend, you are not using your chips. Now, there are a few different rules that you could apply to this, because if you have more than one chip, then you just got to be throwing them out as soon as you can now, basically. There's only 3 more races. Now, if you're in a situation like me where you have one chip left, whether it's extra DRS or limitless, because those are the 2 big dogs that you're going to be saving for a sprint race weekend, save it for Qatar. It's a sprint race weekend, you're going to be wanting to use it there. Final fix you can use anywhere, wildcard as well. But like I mentioned, let's say you have extra DRS and wildcard left, I'd probably recommend wildcarding now and extra DRSing in Qatar. But anyway, that about covers up the Las Vegas F1 Fantasy thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all could take something out of this video. Please, please, please get involved. Do the survey. It will really help all of us out as an F1 Fantasy community. Because if we can get enough responses and get F1 to change those little annoying bits of F1 Fantasy, and we all know what I'm talking about. DNFs being -20, driver of the day being 10 points for a bonus. Those sorts of things that are really annoying us about the game, and we want to really improve it because we just love it so much. Please get involved, be a part of changing F1 Fantasy. But thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all later for another F1 video. Bye bye.